Ni hao. F1 returns to China in the Shanghai International Circuit for the first time in 5 years. There was a fire, there was rain, there was chaos. F1 Brake Check is on the air, and Corey and I are here to add insight to all the action. We'll have a brief history of the Chinese Grand Prix. We'll break down the technology in the current F1 power units in part 3 of our Tech Corner series. Corey will fold up my brain in our Stump the Pundit section, and we'll discuss the outcomes of all the craziness from this weekend's action. So buckle up, grab a drink, and settle in. F1 Brake Check is off and running.
Welcome. You are listening to F1 Brake Check, the epic podcast for all things Formula One, where we discuss technology, history, news, and perspective. With your hosts, Scott Vick and Corey Broom.
And we're back with F1 Brake Check. I am Scott Vick, one of your pundits. With me, as always, is my partner in crime, my brother in arms, my fellow race enthusiast, Corey Broom. Corey, how are you doing, sir?
Good, really good. I had a very long weekend, went on a motorcycle trip, so just recovering from that, basically. Ate too much, drank too much. How about you?
Yeah, I understand. No, just a quiet weekend at home. Not a whole lot going on here. So, all right, so shall we jump into it?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so let's talk about the history of the Chinese Grand Prix. So the Chinese government in the early 90s attempted to bring F1 to China by constructing the Zhuhai International Circuit, and upon its completion was provisionally added to the calendar for 1999. However, the circuit failed to meet the FIA safety requirements and was subsequently dropped. In 2002, a 7-year contract was signed by the FIA for the Chinese Grand Prix to take place upon the completion of a planned track in the capital of Shanghai, with the target opening for 2004. The Shanghai International Circuit broke ground in April of 2003 and was completed in 14 months. The new state-of-the-art circuit, designed by Hermann Tilke, hosted its first Grand Prix in September of 2004 and was won on that occasion by Rubens Barrichello driving for Ferrari. However, his teammate Michael Schumacher led the first lap, and his time still stands as the fastest F1 lap at the Shanghai circuit. In 2006, the track also saw the last race ever won by the great Michael Schumacher. 9 drivers have stood on the top step of the podium during the 17 runnings of the race, while Lewis Hamilton owns 6 of those race wins. The track fell silent when in 2019 the race was canceled due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and China's zero COVID policy would see the race removed from the calendar for 5 long years, while the rest of the world moved on. 2024 sees the race return to the calendar, but moved to the early part of the season from its traditional late season slot. This was done presumably to cut down on the amount of travel the teams had to do because of its proximity to Japan and Australia on previous weekends. So, Corey, your thoughts on the return of China to the F1 calendar and about the circuit in general?
Yeah, the circuit in general, I enjoy this track. Just listening to the commentators, Nico was talking about how this track really eats your tires, so you have to be very cautious on your pace. We saw several instances where people were going a little bit too fast, they ate up their tires too fast, and just like Alonso, which I'm sure we'll talk about here in just a little bit, he could have finished really well, but because of tire strategy as well as, and very uncharacteristic for Alonso, he didn't take care of his tires very well, and the track ate him up.
Mm-hmm.
I like that aspect of it, that not only is it a really fast track, but you have to be very aware of your tire deg as well.
Yeah. All right, let's jump into our tech corner then. So this is part 3 of our discussion on the history of Formula One engine rules. And today in this edition, we're going to discuss the components of the current power unit that propel F1 cars to the blinding speeds that they operate at. Currently, there are 4 engine suppliers that lease engines to the teams: Mercedes, Renault, Ferrari, and Red Bull, which is a thinly disguised Honda. Let's be truthful. I say lease because the non-manufacturer teams, i.e. Sauber, Racing Bulls, Haas, Williams, Aston Martin, and McLaren, do not actually purchase their engines, but instead they lease them, and they're not allowed to make any changes or do any kind of work on the engine. All work is done by the engine manufacturers, engineers, and mechanics, including fitting the power unit into the lessee's chassis. Before you think this gives the manufacturing teams an advantage, the current rules do not allow the manufacturing teams to make any changes or upgrades without supplying the same to the customer teams. At the heart of a modern power unit is a 1.6-liter turbocharged V6 internal combustion engine, or ICE. The ICE in an F1 car bears very little resemblance to the standard road car, though. The basic components will be the same: crankshaft, camshafts, turbocharger, spark plugs, electronics, etc. In years past, an F1 engine was allowed to be made out of alloys like magnesium, titanium, high-strength aluminum, beryllium, and other exotic materials. Carbon fiber was used for cylinder heads, pistons, linings, and other internal components. However, all of these have been banned with the new set of regulations. The turbocharger on an F1 car will be massive and can spin to over 150,000 RPMs, as opposed to a road car which spins at a much, much lower rate. The electronics and ignition systems are built and maintained to function at 3 to 4 times the speed at which a normal road car will operate. A standard road car engine will usually rotate between 7 and 9,000 RPMs, or revolutions per minute, with some performance in sports cars revving slightly higher. An F1 car will spin to a maximum of 15,000 RPMs, which gives it its distinctive scream. Another cool bit of tech that differentiates an F1 engine is the combustion system. A standard road car will do a process commonly known as suck, squeeze, bang, and blow. During the engine rotation, the piston will travel down and suck in an atomized mixture of air and gas. Then, as the piston rotates and rises back inside the cylinder, it will squeeze the air-fuel mixture into a very dense state. When the piston has reached maximum compression, a spark from the ignition system will ignite the mixture, creating the bang, and force the piston back down. As the piston is being driven down, the exhaust valves at the top of the cylinder will open and blow out spent gases. In an F1 car, the air-fuel mixture is pulled into 2 separate areas of the cylinder. At the top of the cylinder is a pre-ignition chamber that will only have a very small amount of the fuel-air mixture. The ignited mixture will then create a jet of super hot flame that will then ignite the remaining compressed air-fuel mixture in the lower chamber. This results in a much more complete burn of the fuel and will produce exponentially more amounts of power. Additionally, as we talked about last week, the modern F1 engine uses a set of pneumatic valves to control intake and exhaust gases, large bore pistons with incredibly short connection rods attached to the crankshaft, which allow the engines to achieve its mind-bending rotation speed. All of this innovation does have to overcome some limitations that the 2014 rules required. All F1 cars are fitted with a fuel flow regulator that limits the amount of fuel that the engine can use at any given moment to 100 kilograms at 10,500 RPMs, and the maximum pressure at which the fuel can be delivered is also restricted. Next, we have the energy storage, which is essentially a lithium-ion battery, much like a traditional electrical vehicle, but the battery has to have a minimum weight of 20 kilograms and a maximum weight of 25 kilograms per the regulations. The battery can only be a single unit. It can't be split up into multiple pieces to assist with weight balancing, and it has a limit to the amount of energy that the battery can store at any given point. The hybrid system generates electricity, and the power can be stored and used to augment the engine to provide extra power and torque while making the power unit exponentially more powerful from its diminutive size. The next component that we're going to talk about is the MGUK. This stands for Motor Generated Unit Kinetic. So a primitive version of the MGUK has been experimented with in Formula One for decades, usually referred to as a KERS, or Kinetic Energy Recovery System. But that didn't become standard until the regulation change in 2014. The MGUK uses an electric motor connected to the engine's crankshaft that takes the energy that would normally be lost during braking and collects that energy, which can then be deployed as an extra 160 brake horsepower, or the motor can also be used to store energy in the battery system for deployment later. Oftentimes, the teams will map a circuit to decide where they will deploy the extra power or where they will harvest the energy to be stored in the battery system. Generally, full power will be used continuously over a single lap during qualifying, while it will be more judiciously used on the straights and out of low-speed corners during the race. The next component that we're going to talk about is the MGU-H, which stands for Motor Generator Unit Heat. This motor is situated inside the turbo between the turbine fan and the compressor fan. The MGU-H uses the heat produced by the power unit's exhaust to generate electricity. The electricity then takes and drives a small motor that keeps the compressor turning when it normally would not, i.e. low speed corners, idling, etc., and eliminates the dreaded turbo lag, resulting in the same instantaneous power that would be produced by a larger, normally aspirated engine. Like the MGU-K, the MGU-H works in two ways in that it can either deploy the energy it harvests or it can be immediately deployed to add additional power to the turbo unit. This concludes our technical breakdown of the screaming power units used in F1. Next week, we will have part 4 of our 3-part series where we'll discuss the new power unit rules coming in 2026 and beyond, and what it will mean for the 4 current suppliers and the new kids, Audi and Ford. Corey, your thoughts on the current F1 power units as opposed to maybe some of the previous generations?
I understand why they're going this route as far as the power units trying to save and try to go net zero by 2026. But I think we talked about on the last podcast where I love the sound of the V12s, V10s. You just can't beat that sound. Oh, I miss that sound.
And believe me, there is a reason behind that. There's actually Scott Mansell, who has the fabulous Driver 61 channel on YouTube, has this week actually did a beautiful breakdown of why everyone seems to love the sound of the V10 engine. Basically, to boil it down, it's because of the way that the harmonics of the V10 engine in the order in which it's fired creates a sound that comes through the exhaust that is immediately pleasing to humans. And so the Formula One V10 engines actually have a scientific reason why most people absolutely love the sound of those engines.
Wow, that's cool.
And why a lot of people would love to see them come back. All right, so listeners, what do you think about the current state of the Formula One engines or about any of the particular components that we talked about during the Tech Corner? Or if there's something that you would like to know more about the way a particular component works, because we talked about it at a very high level, leave something in the comments. Tell us what you want to hear, and we'll be able to make sure we do a deeper dive into any of those components that you want to hear about or any of the regulations in future Tech Corners.
Now on to Stump the Pundit.
Yeah.
All right. So I have 4 questions for you.
Okay.
You and I have both commented on how awesome we think that Frederick Vasseur has been at Ferrari. So can you name 2 other teams that he's been with in Formula One?
He's been with Sauber, and the other one is escaping me. It's like I can see the shirt, but I can't read the name on it. So want to say that he was he at Alpine back when it was still called Renault?
Renault, yeah.
All right.
Also known as. All right. Next one. When was DRS introduced? What year?
DRS was introduced, I want to say it was somewhere. I'm pretty sure that DRS was introduced before the current power unit regulation. So I want to say it was introduced somewhere around 2011, 2012, somewhere in there.
2011. You're right.
Okay.
Nice.
All right.
Yeah.
2 for 2.
We all know the fastest pit stop so far. McLaren owns it.
Yes.
Blindingly fast pit stop. So now let's think about the slowest pit stop. Who was it? How long was it? Or what year or track was it? I'll take any of those answers.
Okay.
So driver, which driver it happened to, how long it was, what year, or what track?
Okay. Well, let's see. Now, there's a couple of ways that I can go on this, because I could point out that there have been some longer pit stops due to the team having to do a repair on the car or something along those lines. But I don't think but in the spirit of the way that the question was asked, I'm going to assume that that's not what you're looking for. You're just looking for a standard pit stop.
I'll give you a clue. So it's a driver that's currently racing.
Okay.
And it's fairly recent, within the last.
Okay, so I'm going to go with Bottas at Australia, which was what, 50 something seconds?
It is Bottas, but that's not the slowest pit stop.
It's not the slowest. Okay.
It was 2021.
Okay.
Obviously, he's still with Mercedes. It was Monaco.
Okay.
Valtteri, and it was for 43 hours and 15 minutes. It was, I don't remember that one time when they couldn't get that tire off.
Yes.
They were fighting, and Bottas was at second place at the time. When he came in for that pit stop, he couldn't get that wheel nut off.
Yes.
So it was time for 43 hours and 15 minutes. That is the slowest on record pit stop. Sauber, that makes your pit stops look blindingly fast.
Yes, absolutely.
Last question. About how long does a Formula One tire last?
On average, the hards are supposed to last somewhere around 100 miles of usage.
Yeah, you were close. Right around 200 kilometers. So that's 130 or so miles.
Yes.
Right around that. Yeah. So very good. And that's it.
All right. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Very cool. Let's get into the action from this weekend. So, like I said at the beginning, we had everything this weekend. We had fire, we had rain, we had chaos. Yeah. So, up and down the pit lane. So, first of all, let's talk about the fire. It was really interesting that during FP1 and the initial sprint qualifying that we had not one, but two fires that broke out around turn 5. These were generated because there's a number of bumps coming through the turn 5 complex where the skid plates were bottoming out and throwing sparks off of it, and the dry grass actually caught fire. But what was really funny was the fact that we had several of the drivers were reporting into the pit lane saying, hey, there's a fire on the grass in turn 5, which just goes to show you that just these drivers, because they are so attuned to and aware of what's going on around them, not just in the car, but outside the car, that they were actually able to see the fire and were able to report it into the pit lane.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the practice. Okay. So like we talked about in the preview last week, this is the first time in 5 years that the teams have raced at China. It's the first time that they have raced under the current ground effect regulations. Almost half of the field had either never driven on the track or they were rookies the last time that Formula One raced at the Shanghai circuit. So we got the expected chaos that we kind of expected. Now, some of that was just simply because teams were trying to gather data. So we wound up with Lance Stroll leading the pack, and we wound up with Lando and both of the Mercedes and Fernando in his Aston Martin at the bottom of the timesheets. I mean, we had Logan Sargent actually ran faster by a pretty wide margin over Lando and the two Mercedes, which I thought was just very, very telling about just what kind of chaos the lone practice session that we had.
Yeah.
And that chaos actually carried over into the sprint shootout later that afternoon. So we started off in the dry. For the first time this year, it was a pretty disastrous outing for Yuki, unfortunately. For the first time, he did not make Q3. Got knocked out in Q1 and sat at a lowly 19th, and he was almost like just a little under a tenth of a second faster than Logan Sargent at number 20. So pretty disastrous qualifying for him. And same thing for Lance Stroll, who went from the top of the charts during FP1 to being just barely squeaking into Q2. Your thoughts on the first part of qualifying when we were doing it, when it was being run in the dry?
Lando comes in first, and then Hamilton second, and then Max being fourth. That one was a shocker, right? And then obviously Max takes it home for the win, and then Hamilton had some problems later on. But Lando did fantastic, and they showed, well, at least Lando did. He showed really well this weekend.
Yeah. which was very surprising because, well, first of all, for us to get to Q3, though, we do have to mention, though, that midway through Q2, the skies opened up and the rain came down.
Yep.
And this caught, a number of the drivers out. And it also jumbled up the order because one of the great differentiators is the difference between wet and dry. And we definitely saw that on display during the Q2 and especially during the Q3 qualifying, where Lando took and had an absolutely storming lap to take the pole in the sprint shootout and did it by over a second and a half over second place Lewis Hamilton.
Yeah.
And like you said, Max Verstappen had a pretty awful Q3 session, actually went off the track on a couple of instances, which is very uncharacteristic of Max. We saw it catch out George Russell and his Mercedes, and he got knocked out during Q2. One of the things, though, that became very apparent, though, is that coming into the race weekend, we disagreed. And both you and I thought that McLaren would have a very good showing this weekend and that the track would really suit the car. But coming into the weekend before FP1 started, both Oscar and Lando were saying, well, we don't think the car is going to go very well. We think slower speed, long, continuous corners were not going to suit the car very well. And we saw that to be exactly the opposite. So it's like, how much do you think of it was a surprise for McLaren? And how much of it do you think it was them kind of, not for lack of a better term, sandbagging?
I absolutely think they were sandbagging. I have no doubt about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's just how they are, right?
So we get into the sprint race, and first of all, Lando doesn't get a great start. Hamilton pulls alongside him going into turn one, and then going through those aforementioned very long, I said slow corners, but they're more of a medium speed corner, but they're also very, very long corners. And Hamilton stuck to his guns. Lando tried to be as brave as possible, but ends up going off in turn 4 and tumbles down the order, and Hamilton starts to pull away. And I thought, all right, well, we're going to have a very interesting sprint here.
Yeah.
Which it did manage to do for the first few laps, because Hamilton managed to lead the first 9 laps before Max worked his way up through the field past Fernando, and then eventually passed Hamilton and started to move away. But all in all, I thought that it was a very, very interesting race. Let's talk about race qualifying. So the sprint finishes up. We go into the qualifying. First of all, it was a really exciting Q3 where at one point we had 5 or 6 drivers all vying for the pole. Yeah. And we had 5 or 6 drivers that all sat on the pole for a short period of time before Max came home and ended up taking the pole by about 0.3 of a second. Yeah. But another horrible qualifying for poor Yuki. Again, this qualifying was also another instance where he didn't make it even out of Q1 for the first time this year. And it was the first time that I think we've seen both Alpines actually qualify, make it through to Q2, which was somewhat of a surprise. But it was also a really good day for Valtteri Bottas, who was actually able to qualify, who was actually able to make it into Q3 on both the sprint shootout and in qualifying. Right. So unfortunately, his race and his sprint race, not so great. Ends up finishing 12th in the sprint race, and unfortunately was saddled with a DNF pretty early on into the race.
It was such a horrible spot for him. He was having such a great drive, and then that happened to get a DNF.
Yeah.
Heartbreak.
Yes, absolutely. Talking about the race, first thing we got to talk about is, okay, so it is poor Yuki's retirement in the fact that he basically gets punted off by one of the Alpines. I forget which one it was, but he basically gets hit by one of the Alpines, punctures his tire, sends him off the track, and ends his day in the gravel trap. Poor Yuki. Just a disastrous weekend. And I think that after the highs of Japan and the last few weekends where he's shown really, really well. I think he's ready to write this one off and say, hey, let's get on to Miami and let's regroup and get on to Miami. After Bottas's retirement, he has a mechanical issue, has to pull the car off on track, brings out the safety car. And as they're going back for the restart, Lance Stroll drives right up the back end of Daniel Ricciardo. When you're coming to the restart, you need to be just as much aware of the car in front of you as the rest of them. As you can see very clearly on the in-car footage, Lance was focused more on the apex of the turn, and he was not looking at Ricciardo's back end. So when Ricciardo had to brake because of the rest of the cars had braked and the subsequent backup, Lance just basically, he goofed it up. For me, the performance of the race, though, definitely has to go to Fernando Alonso, who actually had to make a late pit stop because the sprint had, you had mentioned earlier today, very uncharacteristic of Fernando, is his tire management wasn't up to his usual standard. He tried to hang on with medium tires for as long as he could, but they finally just had given up the ghost. He has to make a third pit stop. You know, unlike the rest of the front runners who only made one or two stops, he had to make a late third stop to take on a new set of mediums. But then he rejoined in, I think it was either 12th or 13th, and he basically carved his way through the field in order to claim 7th in the race. Yeah. And also took fastest lap. So I got to say that was probably one of the most impressive drives that I've seen from any driver this season.
Him and Lando Norris, they had two spectacular drives this race. It was amazing. Alonso, after that third pit stop, you could see he was just ticking down the cars in front of him. Given enough time, he would have gotten back up near podium or maybe even onto podium. The time just wasn't there.
And you just mentioned Lando too. Is Lando, after he ran wide and tumbled down in the order during the sprint, he definitely redeemed himself after qualifying 4th for the race. He put in an absolutely brilliant drive to come home 2nd during the race. Very well-deserved podium, and he was only 13 and a half seconds off of Max Verstappen. His McLaren team did an absolutely brilliant job on his pit strategy, and he did an amazing job of saving the tires so that he ended up only having to do one pit stop during the course of the race and brought it home in a very well-deserved 2nd place.
Definitely. Very happy to see him. Now, hopefully this season we'll see a podium for him, an actual first place.
Yeah, like I said a couple of podcasts ago, I don't think it's really a matter of if he's going to win this year. I think it's just a matter of when. This is actually the first race of the season where we didn't have a 1-2 finish by the winning team. We've already talked about Ricciardo qualifying Yuki for the first time this year in both the sprint and the race qualifications. Tsunoda just had a really, really awful weekend, some of it of his own design. One other thing, though, that I wanted to talk about that made news was what looked like a resurgence by Mercedes, with Hamilton having an absolutely amazing qualifying in the sprint shootout and a really, really solid sprint. And then they made some changes to the car between the sprint race and qualifying, because under the new sprint rules, there's actually 2 parc fermé rules now in place. So there's a parc fermé that starts at the beginning when the car first takes to the track for the sprint shootout, but then after the sprint race, they're allowed to make any changes to the car that they want to. And then when they go out for their first lap of qualifying for the race, then it's the second parc fermé rules that go into effect. Mercedes made a change to the car between the sprint race and qualifying and sent Hamilton tumbling far, far back into the order. Now, he did do a really good job of taking the car and going from getting knocked out in Q1 to being able to bring the car back home in the points, which I thought was another brilliant drive that went right up there with Fernando and Lando. You've got to wonder, is like, how could Mercedes do so well, make a slight change to the car, and send Hamilton so far back in the order.
know.
It doesn't make any sense.
None at all. I mean, they got it right, just like you said. Sprint weekend, they got it right, and then the race, they muddled it all up. It was crazy that he had such a good sprint, and then just to be gummed up like that during the actual race, it's a heartbreaker for him as well.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. Yeah, no, you definitely total parallels that could be drawn there.
Yeah.
All right, so last thing we got to talk about though is Toto keeps poking the bull because he keeps, it's like because of all of the internal struggles at Red Bull that we all know that there is still this internal power struggle that is going on between Helmut Marko and Christian Horner. There is allegations that have flown around, some of them substantiated, some of them very, very much unsubstantiated. And then on top of that, you've got Toto who keeps, I don't know if he's trying to make Max think about his decision to whether he wants to stay at Red Bull or whether he wants to take and drop a bomb, driver market, and move to Mercedes.
Yeah, right. I absolutely love that he's poking Red Bull. It's entertaining more than anything else to me. Whether Max is actually talking to him or, like you said, maybe it's just planting that seed of doubt in Max's head. Do I really need to be at Red Bull next year? Can I go somewhere else? Can I exercise my options somewhere else? Who knows? But we commented a few weeks ago on that Red Bull with Helmut Marko, with his antics, and with Christian Horner with his antics, that really leaves a very bad culture in place. People are very unhappy with treating other people that way. They don't want to be associated with that kind of organization. Christian's done this a few times to Toto, and now Toto's kind of thrown it back at him. So I don't know.
Yep.
I just find it really entertaining. So
yes, it is definitely entertaining. That is for sure.
Yeah.
As we've said on a number of occasions this year, driver market, especially as we start to get closer and closer to the summer break, is going to get crazy.
Yeah.
It's going to be super fun to watch.
Oh yeah. I think this is probably the silly season that I'm looking forward to the most, seeing what happens.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so shall we wrap it up?
Oh yeah, we're ready.
Okay, so sounds good. All right, so track curfew is upon us and it's time to put the car in the garage. Join us next week when Corey and I will preview F1's first return stateside for the Miami Grand Prix. Stump the Pundit will once again muddle my brain like a bad mojito, and we'll break down the latest news and rumors, and we'll have another riveting discussion in our tech corner. So until next time, he's Corey, I'm Scott, we are the pundits of F1 Brake Check. Let's go!
Thank you for listening to F1 Brake Check. If you have enjoyed what you heard, don't miss a single episode by hitting that subscribe button in your favorite podcatcher, or you can watch the video version on YouTube. Help us grow by sharing us with your friends and fellow F1 fans. You can contact us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, TikTok and X at F1 Brake Check. Our website is f1brakecheck.com, where you will find links to all our content. We value your passion and your feedback, so please take a moment to review our podcast. Your reviews help us grow and improve, and it means the world to us. Share your thoughts, rate us, and let us know how we can make the show experience even better. F1 Brake Check is a production of Brake Check Media. For your hosts Scott Vick and Corey Broom, until next time, keep yourself inside track limits, and try not to pitch it in the kitty litter.